Nithyananda. To Ahora Digital and ATB media outlet that claim to champion truth while peddling dangerous fabrications, your recent coverage on KAILASA and the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism represents not merely flawed journalism but a calculated assault on indigenous sovereignty worldwide. What we are witnessing is not investigating reporting but weaponized media serving in the enforcement arm of indigenous interests. Behind your veneer of investigative reporting lies an unmistakable colonial objective: preventing indigenous communities from forming alliances outside approved colonial channels, criminalizing indigenous diplomatic engagement, and ultimately sending a clear message that indigenous communities have no right to participate in the international community on equal terms. This calculated targeting, in agreement to which the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism is not even a signatory, reveals a true agenda, not factual reporting, but the systematic persecution of indigenous leaderships. Ahora Digital, we will systematically dismantle each of your false allegations with documented facts that expose the depth of your anti-indigenous agenda. Your characterizations of KAILASA as the fictitious betrays your colonial mentality and represents fundamental attack on indigenous sovereignty and the self-determination right. This is not merely a semantic disagreement but a calculated attempt to erase the existence of indigenous community worldwide. KAILASA fulfills every criterion established by the Montevideo Convention: a permanent population, unified by cultural, religious and historical bonds, defined territory with established sovereignty, a functional government structured with comprehensive administrative capabilities, active capacity for international relations demonstrated through the diplomatic agreements globally. The Montevideo Convention explicitly states in Article 3, the political existence of the state is independent of recognitions by other states, and Article 13 of the Charter of Organizations of American States further reinforces the political existence of the state is independent of recognition by other states. Even before being recognized, the state had the right to defend its integrity and independence. This is not an interpretation, it is international law. The doctrine of continuity in international customary law is very clear. Upheavals, revolutions, or temporary loss of territorial control do not affect a state's existence. Multiple non-traditional sovereign entities exist globally, including the Vatican and the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. Yet, you uniquely challenge KAILASA sovereignty. And this selective application of a standard reveals your agenda, the erasure of indigenous sovereignty. Your portrayal of conservation partnership as fraudulent land acquisition is deliberately deceptive and reveals your deep-seated colonial mentality. Understand the facts that these agreements between US-based indigenous organizations and Bolivian communities are conservation partnership that explicitly respect indigenous ownership and sovereignty, not land acquisition or land grab in any sense. Understand the fact that this partnership focus on environmental protection, preservation of indigenous knowledge system, humanitarian aid and the cultural exchanges. And Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism is not a signatory to these agreements. Your deliberate misattributions reveal your intention to attack the entire indigenous diaspora worldwide. These agreements comply fully with the Bolivian law, Law number 465 and ILO Convention 169, which mandate state approval. Article 30, Section 2.4 of the Bolivian Constitution explicitly guarantees indigenous people the right to self-determination and territoriality. Article 403, Section 1 states, the integrity of indigenous territory is recognized, which includes the right to maintain and develop their own forms of economic, cultural and spiritual life. Then why does Ahora Digital believe these constitutional rights apply to everyone except certain indigenous communities. Your allegations of financial exploitations expose your colonial capitalistic framework that reduces sacred indigenous relationships to mere monetary transactions. This reveals a profound ignorance of indigenous values and relationships that stretches back millennia. These financial components are investment in community development, environmental protections, and cultural preservations managed by the communities themselves according to their own priorities. Indigenous leaders exercise their constitutional right to determine the value of this partnership. Your suggestion that indigenous leaders cannot make informed decisions is profoundly racist and colonial, infantilizing indigenous people, the very definition of colonial exploitations. Why to focus on consensual financial arrangements between the indigenous communities while completely ignoring the massive exploitations of indigenous land by extractive industries? The contrast is stark. These partnerships center on investing in communities and conservations, while extractive industries deplete resources and leave environmental devastations. Your claim that these agreements violate indigenous sovereignty represents the height of colonial hypocrisy and reveals your true agenda. The Bolivian Constitution explicitly guarantees indigenous people the right to self-determination and territoriality. In Article 30, Section 2.4, these communities exercised precisely this right when forming these voluntarily partnerships. Article 36 of the UN Declarations on the Right of Indigenous People specifically ensures indigenous peoples their right to maintain and develop contacts, relations, and operations with their own members as well as the other people across border. All negotiations were transparent with full disclosure and in the presence of community witnesses and leaders. Terms were documented, translated, and explained in detail to ensure complete understanding and the informed consent. The real violations of indigenous sovereignty is your paternalistic suggestions that the indigenous community need protection from forming partnerships of their choosing. This colonial mindset, which treats indigenous people as incapable of making informed decisions, is a true threat to indigenous self-determination that has justified colonization for centuries. Both Ahora Digital and ATB have launched vicious personal attacks against the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism that reveal your systematic campaign of religious persecutions against the indigenous leadership specifically and the entire indigenous diaspora more broadly. You deliberately suppress these court-documented exonerations. Complete judicial exoneration by the Gujarat High Court on February 2, 2024, the court directly interacted with the women falsely portrayed as kidnapping and verified their well-being and freedom, stating the court satisfied that both are adults, mature enough to understand their well-being and apparently are happy at the place where they are presently proceeding on their spiritual path. Vindications by an Ohio federal court that ruled in the favor of Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism and fined the false rape accuser nearly $500,000 for defamation. The Karnataka High Court declarations in 2012 ordered that his arrest, the arrest of Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism, was illegal, without any authority, contrary to law, and without jurisdiction, quashing the entire unlawful proceeding. Medical evidences conclusively demonstrate that the biological impossibility of the allegation. The Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism testosterone was measured at 12.5 nanogram, which is less than 6% of the minimum normal level. And Interpol has categorically refused request to issue any notice against the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism, recognizing the political nature of the persecution. Your continued promotion of allegations explicitly rejected by the court worldwide, reveals that it is not journalism but targeted religious persecution. The pattern is very clear. You consistently use the terms like self-proclaimed guru for indigenous leaders while treating leaders of other faith with respect. This double standard reveals your specific animus against indigenous spiritual traditions. Ahora Digital, you frame standard diplomatic protocol as political controversy, while never questioning identical activities from the Western organizations. What you maliciously frame as controversy is the standard diplomatic protocol followed by the representatives of all the nations seeking to build international relations. Meeting with government officials is precisely how international relations function. You deliberately imply impropriety in absolutely normal diplomatic activities you would never question from the Western nations. This double standard reveals your colonial mindset that indigenous organizations should not engage in international diplomacy. Your implication that the government officials somehow acted improperly by meeting with the indigenous representatives. This represents an attempt to intimidate officials into refusing meeting with the indigenous organizations, a direct attack on indigenous diplomatic right. Meanwhile, you show no concern for actual improper government relations with the exploitative industries that damage indigenous land and the communities. Your selective outrage emerges only when the government officials engage with indigenous organizations, revealing that your concern is not for the propriety but for maintaining colonial control mechanism. You transform environmental protection into exploitation in a breathtaking Orwellian inversion of reality. These partnerships are explicitly designed for ecological preservation, focusing on preserving biodiversity and ecosystem integrity, maintaining forest integrity against illegal logging and exploitations, supporting sustainable indigenous management practices rooted in millennia of traditional laws, creating sustainable economic alternative to destructive resource extractions. While you manufacture false concerns about indigenous conservation partnership, you remain deafeningly silent about the actual exploitations by the mining companies, oil drilling corporations, and logging corporations, the very industry that often finance media operations. Your allegations of a pattern of similar activities across multiple countries is a deliberate attempt to criminalize the legitimate global indigenous solidarity. Yes, indigenous organizations engage with indigenous community worldwide, and this isn't a pattern of fraud but a systematic commitment to the global indigenous solidarity, cultural preservations, and mutual support between persecuted communities. These engagements include humanitarian aid, cultural exchange programs, environmental conservations, and diplomatic relationship building, all standard international activities which you would never question from the Western organizations. The real pattern is the systematic persecution of indigenous organizations whenever they form relationships outside colonial control. Your reporting follows the exact same template used against indigenous partnerships worldwide, revealing a coordinated attempt to isolate indigenous communities from global solidarity network. Your claim of false representations at international forum is a deliberate attempt to delegitimize legitimate partnership participation in the global governance by indigenous representatives. Indigenous representatives have legitimately participated in UN Forum on Human Rights, Indigenous Issues and Religious Freedom following established protocols for civil society participations that are open to all qualifying organizations. The United Nations has published over 21 reports documenting the persecution faced by KAILASA and the indigenous communities worldwide recognizing these legitimate concerns. Your claim that this constitutes false representations reveals your belief that indigenous representatives should be uniquely denied the right to participate in international forum. You deliberately mischaracterize legitimate UN forum participations as sneaking in or misrepresentations, the language you never apply to Western NGOs participating in identical processes. Your allegations of threat and intimidation is a fabrication designed to silence the legitimate criticism of your persecution campaign and criminalize indigenous advocacy for basic rights. What you characterize as a threat are standard legal notifications requesting corrections, accountability mechanism used by organizations worldwide to uphold journalistic integrity. You provide zero specific evidence of actual threats because none exist. This allegation relies entirely on vague, unsubstantiated claims designed to portray indigenous self-defense as aggression. The real intimidation is being perpetrated by media outlets against indigenous communities that engage with indigenous organizations. These communities report pressure and intimidation to terminate their relationship with indigenous partners. Your allegations of divisive community tactics is a colonial projection that attributes your own divide and conquer strategies to indigenous organizations engaging respectfully with indigenous communities. Indigenous representatives have consistently engaged with indigenous communities through their legitimate governance structure and leadership. All agreement explicitly acknowledge and respect traditional decision-making processes, which is fundamental to indigenous sovereignty. What you characterize as division is actually indigenous communities exercising their constitutional right to self-determination, including forming relationships outside colonial control structure that have historically exploited them. Meanwhile, you ignore the actual divisive tactics employed by the extractive industry that routinely bribe community members, create parallel leadership structures, and deliberately sow international conflict to gain access to indigenous resources. ATB, your allegations of immigration law violations is yet another fabrication designed to criminalize legitimate travel and diplomatic agreement by indigenous representatives. All indigenous representatives traveling internationally fully comply with the relevant immigration laws and the visa requirements. They enter countries legally, maintain appropriate visa status, and depart in accordance with the immigration regulations. The Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism is not directly involved in these diplomatic initiatives. These are independent actions by the organizations whose representatives have proper immigration status. Your deliberate confession reveals your intent to persecute the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism specifically. Diplomatic representatives from the sovereign entities like KAILASA follow a standard protocol for international diplomatic engagement, including appropriate visa applications based on the nature of their activities. You provide zero specific evidence of any immigration violations. No documentations, no government statements, no legal proceedings, because none exist. This allegation relies entirely on the vague, unsubstantiated claim designed to obstruct legitimate diplomatic engagement. Your allegations reveal a colonial double standard. Diplomatic representatives from the Western organizations routinely engage in identical activities without their immigration status being questioned. Only indigenous representatives face this intense scrutiny of routine international travel. The Vienna Convention on the Diplomatic Relations recognizes the need for diplomatic immunity and special considerations for the officials' representatives are principles that should apply to indigenous nations representative as well. To Ahora Digital and ATB, your reporting constitutes an active continuation of colonial oppressions against indigenous people worldwide. This is not hyperbole. It is the harsh reality facing persecuted community who dare to reclaim their sovereignty. You are deliberately reopening the wounds of indigenous genocides, wounds that have never fully healed, and sadistically pouring salt into them just for the ratings and the corporate profit. The pain of centuries of colonial brutality, where millions of indigenous peoples were massacred, where indigenous knowledge systems were systematically erased, where sacred sites were desecrated. This multi-generational trauma is being weaponized and exploited with the full knowledge of the harm you cause. Every headline calling KAILASA fictitious, every broadcast criminalizing indigenous partnership, every fabricated allegations serve as a single purpose: maintaining colonial power structure that allow a continued exploitations of indigenous land, resources and spirituality. This is not journalism, it is the media arm of ongoing colonial occupations and the cultural erasure. More than 40 media outlets from the 14 countries have already recognized their complicity in this persecution campaign and removed defamatory content against indigenous communities, including major outlets like Washington Post, MSN, CBC Canada and numerous others. Will you continue to stand on the wrong side of the history, or will you return to the basic journalistic standards of the truth and fairness? The brutal irony cannot be overlooked. You proudly commemorate indigenous suffering of certain communities while actively inflicting new wounds on the other indigenous community fighting for survival. You shed crocodile tears over historical colonial atrocities while actively perpetuating the same colonial violence today. This persecution will not silence us. This hate speech will not erase us. This campaign of disinformation will not prevent the revival of indigenous traditions worldwide. To indigenous communities worldwide facing similar media persecution, your struggle is our struggle. To media outlets continuing this campaign, historically records your complicity in the cultural genocide, and the future generations will judge you accordingly. The world is watching, history is recording, and the truth, despite your efforts, will prevail.